Thank you, Megan, for that introduction. I am actually now a Labour councillor for Kilburn, so that's good. I feel a bit out of place here today, a bit like, because I'm a person of faith, I think in terms of religious stories that I've been brought up in, a bit like Daniel in the lion's den. This morning I saw a lovely cartoon when I was looking up for jokes about Daniel in the lion's den, which has a lovely picture of Daniel, and underneath it says, "That Daniel is a great guy. That's the most fun I've ever had with a person without eating them." So I'm hoping that you're not going to have too much fun with me this morning. But the other second story that I thought about in relation to what I wanted to say today, again, is another biblical story of Jacob when he wrestles with the angel in the book of Genesis. And he wrestles with the angel, and at the end he says, "It is good to be here." And it is good for me to be here today. And partly that's because of my experience of the week. I mean, I am probably someone who could be characterized in religious terms as a liberal Catholic Anglican, whatever that means, but someone formed within a tradition of faith that takes liberalism and liberal thought really seriously as well. And I've been asked to write a chapter for a book, because those of you who know a bit about what's going on in the Church of England at the moment, we are incessantly discussing people like me and how we have sex and whether that is in or outside marriage. And I've been asked to write a chapter for a book which proposes a more liberal and progressive view of sex, sexuality, and marriage. And my experience of actually trying to write that this week was that I felt silenced myself about the audience and even the book that it would go out in. And I felt silenced mainly because I didn't actually think that I could talk about my earliest sexual experiences as a person within that, and yet as people of faith, as people of principle who think about issues, all of where we come from is something about the incorporation of our own personal experiences into our ongoing criticism of the traditions in which we wrestle, like Jacob wrestling with the angel. So I suppose the first thing that I wanted to say is that it is good for me to be here because I think that there are multiple forms of faith, there are multiple forms of Christianity, some formed by liberalism, and there are also multiple forms of secularism. Secularism is not a single entity, but it is a plural entity. And it does not necessarily have to be anti-theist or anti-religious or to take the experience of people like me not at all seriously. And like Ronan, of course, I was brought up in the island of Ireland, and I think I became a secularist by default very early on. I come from 3 miles outside Portadown on the way to Lough Neagh, and the whole of my school experience was being collected by a bus which collected Catholic children from little villages and hamlets further up the road, then collected us and then delivered us to different schools. I became a prefect at school for some reason, because I didn't play rugby. The only thing that prefects had to do in my school was that they had to read the Bible in assembly. And I said to Daphne, my RE teacher, but I'm opposed to compulsory worship. She said, well, you're going to go and have to tell the head that. So I had this conversation with the head. He said, but you want to be a priest? And I said, yes, but I don't believe people should be forced to worship. And then when I was ordained, I was a curate in the west of London, in Ruislip. And we had a church school. And in Ruislip, it was very clear to me that the way in which more affluent white people in that community knew how to get their children into school meant that the 2 main schools within the parish were segregated not just on religious lines, but on racial lines, on socioeconomic lines. And so there are real questions to me about faith and church education and what it does to other factors of diversity within our society. Most of my ministry has actually been spent as an NHS chaplain, so I've always worked in secular environments. And of course, there is, within my latter job was with it as lead chaplain of the Royal Brompton and Harefield NHS Trust. And one of the things that I did was make sure that we had a humanist chaplain as well. So there are questions for me about the the state and the state paying for religious people like myself within the NHS, but I'm not sure that I might be on exactly the same extreme as everybody within this room. Then, as a gay person, navigating what it is like to be a gay person in the church, in my present parish, well, first of all, actually, maybe the first thing I'd say about my present parish as well is my present parish is composed of 75% social housing. So because of the demographic changes within that community over the last 30 years, when my predecessor started in our church school, there would have been 0 Muslim students. And now we have 50% Muslim students within our school. It is a very religious school. I go in every week. I do an assembly. They have prayers at the beginning of every day. They have meditation when they come in for break time. It is the most religious school I've ever seen in my life. And I work with it even though I am opposed to faith education. And I do that in a way which recognizes the stories and the histories of the predominantly Muslim children that now sit in front of me because none of the Muslim families have actually asked to be exempt from religious worship. But of course, some of my colleagues in the Church of England would not do it in that way, and that's what I'm very worried about in relation to the principle. Then, as a gay person within the Church of England, this is how I got to know Richard Scorer, obviously. But one of the big experiences of my present parish life was when someone came out as a lesbian within a local parish in the deanery. And it was quite clear that even just coming out as a lesbian, no matter whether she had a partner, whether she was sexually active, whether she was in equal marriage, was simply not acceptable. When that person came to me for pastoral care, it was quite evident that the pastoral care they'd received in the parish in which they'd come out had made them clinically depressed. And I said, I need to take you to the doctors, I need to get you on antidepressants, and I need to get you a therapist. And then we can decide what to do about complaining after that. And it was very plain to me that no one wanted to hear those complaints. I sat in a meeting with my own bishop in which I knew he'd had a letter from this young woman, and he hadn't replied to it in a month. And the bishop had asked to come to a particular meeting in my parish, and I said he couldn't. And he said to me, but I am a bishop. And I said, I don't really care. And I suppose that brings me to, where does someone like me as a person of faith and as a practicing Christian, whatever you may think about that, believing in a fictional God or whatever, where does someone like me become a secularist from? Obviously, Jesus wasn't a secularist in any sense, but it seems to me that a very close reading of the Gospel, certainly in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we have the depiction of a Jesus who is completely non-sectarian in his own time and place and culture. And most of the well-known and famous stories that those of you who aren't too religious might remember from maybe those awful assemblies that you were forced to at school, or things like the parable of the Good Samaritan. The Samaritan who wasn't part of Jesus' own worshipping community. Here is a teaching in which Jesus is very clearly saying that people who are good moral agents in the world may exist outside of your own religious restrictions and boundaries. And I suppose for me, a depiction of the non-sectarian Jesus is where I would say that I am a person of faith who also is a secularist. I want to come back to a few things that have been said about the bishops. I'm not a great fan of bishops, as you can tell already, and I don't think they should be in the House of Lords, and I do think that we should be disestablished as well. But I think it is more problematic, actually, what is happening in the Church of England than even some of my colleagues here on this stage have said already. Keith, earlier in his address, referred to Jordan Peterson, Russell Brand, or maybe it was Stephen, and that somebody might comment on it. The thing is that Russell Brand was baptized by Bear Grylls in a river, and Bear Grylls has been the poster boy for the Holy Trinity Brompton expansion of religion within the Church of England. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself was on the parish council of Holy Trinity Brompton. And within the Church of England, Holy Trinity Brompton has this a clear vision of church planting, where they go and clone themselves in other places. Much of it is financed by Paul Marshall, who now owns The Spectator. And if we look at how things are financed within the Church of England, some of you may well have been to the lovely new Lambeth Palace Library, where there is the Centre for Cultural Witness. Much of this was financed by Paul Marshall, who is a great friend of the archbishops. So there's a real question for me in relation to the internal governance of the church about transparency of influence, about the influence of money, the importation of culture wars from the United States by people evangelicals who are impressed by what is happening there. And that is a real problem right at the heart of the Church of England, which I think makes it completely impossible for anyone who is a proper follower of Jesus Christ to think that we should be an established church at all. But maybe, in concluding, I want to come round to a bit of a challenge to you, and that's because I'm not used to writing speeches. It's mostly sermons, and they always end with a challenge. I wonder, in relation to the assisted dying issue, whether or not those of us who propose liberal values need to think slightly more carefully about some of the criticisms that are coming from people of faith. If liberal values are based on conceptions of the human person as an autonomous agent who has choice all the time, there are lots of people in our society who do not have that degree of autonomy or choice. And that's, I suppose, where people coming from the disability communities, I think, are really important to listen to on what an assisted dying bill that has safeguards in place for other people is really important. Because we are not simply cognitive individual agents. We are people who are brought up within communities as social beings, and we have affective sides to our personalities as well. And that may be the positive thing that we need to learn from communities of faith. However, when someone like John Inge, who is one of the more liberal bishops in the Church of England, retweets something and says that now is the time in which bishops are most needed within the House of Lords, I want to say to John Inge, get a life. It's not just religious people who are good moral agents in the world. So that's my first challenge. And my second challenge is in relation to immigration and racial diversity within our society. The obvious thing that strikes me as a person who is the vicar of a black majority church is that this is an overwhelmingly white audience. An overwhelmingly white audience of people of a certain age. And we might want to think about that, because actually most of the liberal human rights issues that I've been involved with in my parish are actually to do with people from Uganda or people from Ghana or people from Nigeria who are fleeing LGBTQIA+ persecution. But these are people of deep faith, people for whom the stories of faith are really essential. And the question for us, I think, is how do we become allies of more people like me?
Thank you.